Well, it's my pleasure to welcome OZ Sultan to the King's Report. Welcome, Mr. Sultan.
Well, Mr. Panzer, thank you for having me.
Well, I mean, you have quite an active bio. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I mean, in terms of politics, you've been the GOP district leader for the 70th Assembly
District.
Right. And co-chair of the Uptown Republican Club. You were a state committee person for New York. Mm-hmm. And you were oversaw narrative warfare on social media for the 2016 Trump-Pence campaign.
That's correct.
So you've been very active. But you also have a background with cyber defense, artificial intelligence, and in financial security technology. So you there's a lot of
the cyber defense and AI. That's basically my day to day. The political work and some of the legislative work is really kind of like, how do we change our neighborhoods?
Right. Okay. Okay. All right. So, all right. That makes sense. All right. Well, look, before we started the interview, we were talking about some threats on our southern border that is often not discussed. So I'd like to ask you about that. Actually, before we start any of that, a few days ago, there was the debate of the Republican candidates for president. Mm-hmm. I'm just curious if you have any comment about the debate, what they discussed and what they did not discuss.
I think Vivek Ramaswamy performed really reasonably well. I think Chris Christie just did a little bit of muckraking. Didn't really address policy issues the way that they should be, and I think Americans are really concerned about that now. Mm-hmm. I think Nikki Haley was reasonably strong in terms of discussions on foreign policy, but I think a little bit maligned in terms of not having a formal stance in Ukraine. Tim Scott performed as he always does. He's really kind of a Republican stalwart, so we know where he sits with things. Asia Hutchinson didn't really say much, did he? Wasn't really that active. And what I will say is that Ron DeSantis at least made some clear points about education, right? Going into this, because at the end of the day, it's us, the parents that really should be the deciders in many cases of what's not just coming in, but also at what age do we find certain topics to be appropriate for elucidation to our children, right? I think we grew up in I'm Gen X. I'm assuming you're Gen X, like boom generation. But we grew up with, you weren't actually getting that kind of education until around gender and these types of things, until you were actually capable of really digesting that. Right. So it was like a teenager, almost pre-puberty. And nowadays what we have is a strong bent to really push past innocence is really what I'm calling it. We're not allowing these children to be innocent. We're also not allowing them to be children, and you've got every sort of political agenda kind of coming down. And I think just a move to sensibility, which is more of like, could we focus on STEM? Could we focus on getting these kids ahead so that they can be competitive in the global landscape, not just against, the Europeans and now the Middle East, Africa region and Asia, but also, inside of a landscape where artificial intelligence, machine learning, metaverse technologies and Web3 are at the forefront. We're in a very interesting time if you think about this, right? We're in a 20-year boom cycle for technology. So what was, starting of the internet is now starting of Web3, right? It's that big. You could literally come out, like the joke we used to make was in 1999 when it was coming out of Carnegie Mellon, I had said things like, you could just go to Silicon Valley and be like, I'm putting pants on the internet. And they'd be like, he's putting pants on the internet. And they'd give you like $2 million to put pants on the internet. Well, nowadays you could be like, I'm using artificial intelligence to fit pants to you. And we've analyzed all these pants. And they'd get really excited and they'd give you $2 million to go and do that in many cases. So there's a lot of liquidity around. So there's that 20-year cycle. There's a 60-year cycle that's hit us, which is literally the flower power generation again. So now we have that kind of, I guess you could call it sexual social upheaval.
Mm-hmm.
We have a move to secularism. So this is across Christians, Muslims, and Jews inside of the United States. On average, when I've talked to rabbis, imams, and pastors, we're talking 30% secular. And this is at Catholic Jesuit universities. This is when I talk to, Islamic leaders at NYU. This is when I talk to rabbis who are working with Yeshiva University, just large secularists, right? So this is very emblematic of like what happened in the 1920s. And then I have to go into that. So you've got 100-year cycle of disease, and you've got 100-year cycle of religious persecution. Because if we go back 100 years to today, you had Hugo Black, who at that time was a KKK supported Democrat, who was advocating for almost, the genocide of Catholics, simply because the ads, the cartoons, everything. So all of this is happening at the same time now. Mm. And inside of all of this, we have poor democratic leadership. We have porous borders. I mean, look, my governor, Kathy Hochul, yesterday came out and blamed the Biden administration. A Democratic governor has come out and blamed the Democratic administration for the problem of migrancy and the fact that there's no solution, and the fact that the porous borders are really only leading to one thing. They're leading into a large-scale degradation of services for Americans on every level,
right?
From housing up, because in Harlem, where we represent 96th Street to about 211th Street. So we're talking about an area that's roughly 2 square miles that has about 4 million people in it. Mm. Right. So each one of us district leaders, there's several 100,000 people, and I'm splitting time now. I'm finishing up some health issues. Like I had been getting through cancer. And so I'm splitting time in between Pennsylvania and New York now in order to wrap that up. But a lot of what we've been driving towards is just the basics. Can we fix some of the homeless situations? Can we, bring in charities to feed people? Can we do all these types of things? And that's a total sidebar, but it's, touching back on like these issues. If grassroots leaders like myself are looking at that, and the government is not looking at the grassroots issues that are basically every constituent now, all across the country, whether you're in a rich neighborhood or a poor neighborhood, food prices, gas prices, that type of a thing, we've got a serious problem.
Look, let me ask you about this. As you've been pointing out and describing, we're living in an age of technology. Okay. And the American people have enormous respect for technology for obvious reasons. Amazing services. When I drive down, my wife and I drove down to Tennessee. We type in the address we want to go to, and the GPS system, which is AI, right? It is guiding us.
It's not AI. It's just utilizing the closest GPS and satellites, and then your cell towers.
But there's an algorithm which is negotiating the path. That's what I mean, right? So, I'm not saying it's advanced, but it's a simple, in my mind, artificial intelligence giving us different paths to go to the route. So I don't have to look at a map. So there are all these services, and we have a lot of trust in experts. And now it seems like the experts at Microsoft, Google, these huge corporations have made an alliance with parts of our government to censor what can be said on their media platforms, censor experts who have dissident voices. And now we have the educational experts in the schools saying, you parents, you don't really know enough about some of these issues about gender identity and so on, but we, the educators, we do. And therefore, we may not even tell you if your son or daughter has come to us and expressed some gender confusion. So, as I understand it, there's a battle now between the experts who it seems like that they're seizing power or they're making alliances with people in government, and the democratic process is being subverted. I don't know if you have any opinion about the 2020 election, whether that was a fair election or not.
Yeah, but the 2020 election definitely had issues of ballot stuffing. I mean, we've seen issues with a lot of rejected ballots, and a lot of sort of like, it's like the hanging Chad issue, right? In terms of some of the processing in New York. I can't necessarily speak to other states. I can just talk about what we have in terms of rejected ballots working with our BOE. Right. But I will say that there's definitely some deltas there that need to be looked at, and evaluated a little bit more with a little bit more scrutiny.
And the problem being, of course, is that anybody who says that they would like to look at some of those issues more closely is accused or labeled by media and by government and by big tech as an election denier in this case, right?
That's and this is a strange sort of, it's a strange precedent here, because if you look at 2016, Hillary ran around for, what was it, 2.5 years saying that it was stolen by the Russians, fake election, fake election, fake election. Right. Turn to 2020. I don't know if I necessarily agree with everything that the Trump team did. And one of my former attorneys, Brandon Paroli, who had actually passed away last year, was part of the recount in Pennsylvania. So I mean, we had, and I am one of the folks in New York City that, like, we recommend our own board of elections officials, right? And so we're involved with the process. We're involved with nominating people to be the poll watchers and all of these things. Right. You've got three issues across the country that are kind of impacted. I'll talk about the voting, and then I'll talk about the school issue really quick. On the voting side of this, we don't have fair representation on a state level basis in many cases from Republicans, and I'll just tell you what happens in New York. If we don't have enough Republican poll watchers, many times because poll watcher names were submitted, but they perhaps were not brought in, right? And I am saying that, perhaps a degree of bias exists, but, we have had these problems before. What the Democrats still do is they'll have a Democrat sign a piece of paper that says, I am acting as a Republican for today.
Oh, really?
So for the sake of democracy. Okay. And one has to ask the question, well, how fair is that? Right. And this is just in New York State, which I can, I can speak to New York and I can speak to Pennsylvania. Those are the two states that I have absolute deep electoral experience with. Other states can't really comment that much. But what I will say is that, there are challenges with these things. We sat down with our BOE. The state had voted to put ranked choice voting in place. And then at the last minute, the state was sued by the Black Democrats, basically saying that this was defrocking people from the electoral process and it was biased. And we know it was biased because 2 months before it was basically suspended. So it's going to be probably a year or two before they figure that one out. But 2 months before the primaries, okay, in 2020, and this was, again, it came up in 2022, they didn't have the algorithm purchased to figure out how they're going to run the ranked choice system. And they were planning on just buying something, not testing it and implementing it. So there's challenges inside of the electoral process, just with the technology, and honestly with like how counts and recounts and things are done. I mean, I'm a big proponent of manual voting, but I'm also a big proponent that if you're going to do mail-in ballots, then those mail-in ballots have to have provenance on them, which basically means let's do a split barcode. So the barcode can be read two ways, but it splits in the middle. One is on the sheet that it was originally connected to. So I can audit this and I can be like, this was going to Richard Panzer because he's traveling on those days. I can see that we validated the barcode. We could then move on. Okay. But that's where the issues and the conversation about stuffing kind of comes up, is because you really don't have provenance on a lot of these things. And then we run into weird things in the state of New York, like 3% physical turnout, 9% mail-in ballot when you have to request a ballot. I mean, how many people do you know that physically request a ballot? The average citizen doesn't actually either go to the BOE or mail anything, right? Right. And now it's finally online, but it's our electoral turnout is abysmal. I mean, it's 3-4%. So you're telling me that the mail-in ballot is more than double that? It doesn't really add up.
I know there's a problem with some people call it dirty voting rolls, voting rolls which include people who've already passed away or moved out of the state or et cetera, and their names are still on the voting rolls. And some people are concerned that there's people are using those names, and and they can research which people have not voted for 10 or 20 or 30 years and use those names and attribute them to mail-in ballots that are basically artificial.
When I ran for office against Brian Benjamin in 2020 in Harlem for the state Senate seat, there were some odd things, I'll just say, because we can't validate these, but there were certain inconsistencies in terms of like how some of the harvesting was done, right? And I've been talking with some folks at the RNC, and I think there's two issues that are never really addressed. One is the death issue, and we've wrangled with the state of New York. Under the Cuomo administration, we had our attorneys submit freedom of information requests multiple times just to get the death rolls. And they're like, we'll give you the numbers, we're not giving you the names. And I'm like, well, then how am I supposed to purge this BOE list of voters to know who's there and who's not? We knocked doors and then we got dead, sorry, she's dead, he's dead. I mean, it's just the most morbid thing. But when you're doing door-to-door GOTV, which is get out the vote, you find these things out. That's the only way to do it. And then we have to, so what was incumbent upon the BOE and the state, at least in terms of accurate record keeping, they're not doing very effectively. Like, there's no purge that's going on. There should at least be, just do a diff in between the death certificates and addresses and names and the voter rolls, but they don't do that. That's problem one. Problem two is people who've moved. So there's a lot of people who've moved. And so what's interesting is that there are organizations that can kind of, command access to that because they have, diehard people, whatever party you are, that will do this. And I think it's less on the Republican side. I haven't really seen it done, but I have seen this kind of harvesting done on the Democratic side a couple of times where it's like, okay, you don't live here, but, they're harvesting the votes. And then the third challenge that you have is colleges, and I don't think people are aware of this. And the college issue is that each one of these colleges, larger colleges, could be somewhere from 20,000 to 100,000 students. Right. They can register to vote right there. They don't have to register it at their home. And so now what you have is I call it like class migration issues, right? Is like it's almost like Thatcher's Britain, But now what you have is, instead of like a lack of access and mobility, you have this basically academic mobility that is impacting the vote where things are. So those are kind of like the three factors that really kind of change the vote locally. And that's at least been our experience with it. And that affects everyone on a national basis. And I think with population moves as well, turning a lot of states purple, you're seeing some of these challenges as well. There are questions of ballot malfeasance. There's questions of, double voting and things like that. And occasionally they'll catch someone, but we honestly need better audit systems on the voting, across the country. But then there's the last problem, which is each state and each county individually has their own procurement and budgets for this process. So in upstate New York, we're still using voting machines from the 1950s. In downstate, in certain precincts, in the remainder of New York, we have, manual. You're not punching them through, but you're just filling out the circles, and then feeding them. But then I'll just get to the last issue, and this goes back to the poll watchers. The last 4 times I went to the poll, I was told that you should vote party line, otherwise your vote might not be counted. Now, when you say something like that to, and this is just the poll watchers telling you that you should, consider voting party line or your vote might not be counted. That is an actual disincentive to third parties, to Republicans. But I really want to talk about the third party access here first before the Republican piece. Governor Cuomo, as well as several other Democratic governors, including Newsom, across the United States, have actively worked to defrock working families, the Constitutional Party, and the Conservative Party from ballot access. Okay, so what that means is that they can't get their candidates on the ballot. And typically, in any state where you've got a D plus or an R plus, okay, you have people running 2-3 parties. And I mean, I ran on the Republican Party, the rent is too damn high party, and the Conservative Party in New York State, right? I was only able to get ballot access in 2 of those. But, so your name will show up multiple times on the ballot. You can't do that anymore. Miranda from Sex and the City, what's her name? She had run on Working Families, right? Mm-hmm. So she ran on the Working Families party platform again, which is a Democratic platform, against Governor Cuomo. And they did a whole bunch of suppression on working families. And then Cuomo defrocked ballot access for working families. So they can barely get their candidates. This is a very left. This is not Republican. Right. They can't even get on the ballot. So these are the kind of issues that we have at the local and the precinct level that I don't think ever make it into the national conversation.
Actually, there's one other issue I want to ask you about. We're using these voting machines from Dominion and other companies, and we're told that they are certified, but from what I understand, they're being certified by vendors or workers who are working for those companies. Is it correct?
There needs to be a dual layer audit system that is driven by Congress and petitioned and brought into law, that basically stipulates, because again, remember, these are state level issues. So Dominion's in maybe, I want to say like 22 states. Right. Some states are still on the old machines. Some are on digital scan. Some are on CHAD. Some are on a digital like touchscreen system. Like there's multiple systems that are out there. But because there are multiple systems out there, I come from technology, right? Right. We have a simple adage, which is if you don't spend about 18 to 22% of your budget on quality assurance, you can be pretty much assured that you won't have a quality product. Right. Okay. And if we're talking about an election cycle as really being a technical process, which it is in many states, I think that we should have, sure, Dominion can do an audit, but the state auditors should be able to come in, and that should be a scheduled bipartisan event in order to really just, double check. And we have manual recounts and a variety of other things, but I also kind of think that we need to bring barcodes, and at least some provenance. I mean, it could be QR codes. It's a matching QR code that's on the sheet that it came from, and it's a matching QR code on the ballot. And we have these ballot books, and we know what was sent to who and when they come back. And harvesting is never going to stop. Okay, but what we can do is we can at least put provenance on these things. We can put provenance on these things we can kind of reduce malfeasance. And that's really where I think we need to be going with this.
So when you say provenance, you mean the ability to connect a ballot to a voter?
Connect the ballot to a voter to a request.
To request.
Yeah. Richard Panzer requested this ballot on March 8th. We sent him the primary ballot on April 14th. And it was this QR code. And when we received it back on May 5th before the primary in June, we verified this QR code with this QR code. It shouldn't be that hard.
Right.
But you need that kind of just basic sanity check on these things, because otherwise, it becomes Guatemala.
Okay, well, let's tip our toe into Central America and since you have knowledge about that, because I guess there are a lot of migrants crossing our southern border. I guess some of them may be voting illegally, but I know you've done research on what is your concern about Venezuela and Nicaragua and other countries in Central America?
Well, let me say something about myself first. So I'm the first generation son of immigrant parents who were sponsored by a steel company, okay, to come to America. And when we brought all of our relatives over, every single time that you brought someone over, you had to put up a $50,000 bond. Okay. You had to say that this person wasn't going to become a public burden.
Right.
This was 30 years of my life. Okay, that we did this when you had relatives coming over, and we had relatives coming over from India and the Middle East, because I'm kind of half Arab, I'm half Indian, product of war. So what was interesting to me, like looking at this as a first generation American who had to like really pay our dues, okay, to get here,
right,
is that it's disproportionately unfair to those of us who were the tired, who were the poor, who were the angry masses yearning to breathe free, because we did have a process for that, okay, at least in the last century. And it wasn't the 18th century process about Ellis Island. It was something different. It was something that was codified. And now folks like myself, Vivek Ramaswamy, just millions of other Americans, okay, who have had to endure all this to get here to do these things, are being told not only that, we're allowing these people in, but they have first dibs at Section 8 housing. They have first dibs at getting welfare and WIC. They have first dibs at all this other stuff. And why am I bringing up all these government programs? Because all of the disenfranchised in my neighborhood, Black, brown, white, Asian, all of them, okay, they start losing their benefits. So it's already difficult and expensive enough to live where we are. I mean, a one bedroom in Harlem these days is ranging between $1,800 to about $3,000 a month.
Right.
All right. That's a mortgage for most people, around. And it's also because our build cost is a lot higher. It's like about $1,200 a square foot. But, when you're looking at those types of things, and you're looking at really just New Yorkers, trying to keep their head above water inside of an arena where COVID has shut down jobs, where all this other stuff has happened. We now have such a large influx of migrants, and this was happening before the busing and the planes and everything else. No one was paying any attention to this stuff. This has been going on for probably about 8-9 years, right? And it slowed down during the Trump administration because they put controls at the border. Without a border policy, which is really Kamala Harris's job, is to come up with border policy. We are in a position that is relatively precarious, because in addition to allowing all these people over the border, there's a lot of people that aren't getting, caught in the process, documented, and they're coming here illegally. And to what you asked was, so I published in Newsmax in 2017 talking about how we had like Al-Shabaab and, other insurgent and extremist terrorists that were literally getting caught at the border coming up.
Right.
More recently, what we're seeing, and I shared a couple articles that you could share out with this, but, Texas is talking about the fact that they've got this massive influx of Chinese migrants all of a sudden. And part and parcel of this is because the yuan internally has been losing value, but also because everything's upside down in China. And financially right now. And so they're looking for opportunity. I get the looking for opportunity part. I'm not lacking empathy in that. What I am asking, and I think every American should be asking, is, okay, Mr. President, Mr. Biden, if you're going to let all these people in, who's paying for it? All right? Because it's a very simple question. If you look at what happened to Texas, to Arizona, to Florida, and now New York, okay, it is to the point where schools cannot support, they can't support the student body. They can't support the linguistic questions because some of them are Spanish, some of them are Chinese, other things. They just don't have the teachers. They don't have the translators. And school projects and school programs are getting cut. Entire football programs have been cut in Texas at certain schools just to deal with the migrant issue coming in. And what it's doing is it's changing neighborhoods in a way where you have unemployed, underemployed, offsetting already unemployed people, specifically in areas like, I'm going to say Harlem and West Virginia. And the thing that Harlem and West Virginia have identical to them, one's predominantly black, one's predominantly white, is that, like, I've been to Weirton and I've been to Fallensby. My dad worked on mills. Okay. Both areas have about 20 to 32%, structural unemployment. And when you start adding and that's just normal. Okay. Because we're talking working class people, working class towns, race, take the race out of it, right? They're just identical data points on these things. So you have all of this unemployment. And then when you start bringing all these migrants in, what do you think you do to unemployment? It goes up. But outside of looking at Bureau of Labor Statistics data and a variety of other things, your average reporter is never talking about this kind of stuff. And they're also not talking about the impact. They're talking about empathy. I'm with you on the empathy. But what about the empathy for the American people who actually need to live and thrive here? You know, where's the empathy for that?
And then, of course, there's actually, we do have to wrap up in a couple of minutes, but what about the issue of terrorism? What about the issue of, we don't know who these people are. One of the purposes of vetting immigrants is to make sure that they are not here to harm our country. What about that?
We've got terrorists coming from, I mean, you've got, they've identified issues with, basically Chinese insurgents. They've identified issues with, I'll call them extremist insurgents now, because this is a perversion of Islam. I mean, you look at ISIS and these groups, and I've published inside of the United States Army Cyber Defense Review on this, about like how they've perverted religion. I mean, they're basically our version of Jonestown on steroids. But we've got ISIS, Al-Shabaab, and Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda now has about 4 flavors. And the problem is that they're very active online. They've got several thousand people working for them just in conscription and radicalization. And with 30% of America being secular nowadays, specifically around Generation Z and Generation Alpha, they're very easily, people are looking for meaning. They're sad. They're not finding themselves. They've been locked in the house for 2 years. The radicalization is moving, into homes and things like that. And it's coming through the internet, through social media. And there's guides that I think parents need to look for. But more importantly, I just don't see our government doing enough to stop this. Like under 45, there was, a fair effort on this. Under 46, there's been a lot of focus on gender equity. But, where's the focus on national security when it comes to these types of things?
Well, maybe their intention is not to protect America. Maybe their agenda is to destabilize America.
One could largely argue that based upon what we're seeing happen in real time. And it could be that. It could just be the fact that they're completely incompetent. I've seen that as well, specifically in New York City. We're seeing that right now with what's going on, with the migrant crisis in our state. Neither the mayor of New York nor the governor really want to address it, and they're just kicking it down the road to Biden. And Biden doesn't seem to have any policy answers either. So it could be either. It could be both. Yeah. But the challenge ahead of us is, I think, threefold. One is that we need to secure, we need to secure the next generations ideologically against kind of the encroachment of terrorists. We need to secure our borders and come up with a strategy of what we're going to do with migrants, because you can't deport all these people, but what are you going to do with these people? Okay. How are you going to at least put management systems in by which, okay, great. Give them maybe an 18-year path to citizenship where they have to pay taxes or something. But something, right? I mean, right now there's nothing. And that's what's causing all this chaos. And then, the last aspect of this is that I'm just going to say this to every single listener that you have. The reason that we have a lot of things that are not reading, writing, arithmetic inside of our education process right now is because on a local level, you allowed your township councils, your sheriffs, your school boards, your PTAs, all of your electeds, okay, to pivot to groups, to basically people that were sponsored by groups that have an agenda. And a lot of their agenda is a change of the education system towards an identity-based purview. And that doesn't really jive with Abrahamic faiths and also how a lot of Americans look at this. So we're going to solve that from a grassroots basis. You need to get locally involved. We're locally involved and we're pushing, and I've been pushing against our Board of Education for about 6 years. Okay. And we're eventually going to get there. But, if you can get people running for these roles locally, these are not necessarily the best paying, sometimes part-time roles, but this is how we change policy in America. And this is also how you change school policy. And I think the elections are coming out, it's a little late now to kind of get involved. But if you can look at the 24 cycle of what's coming up, like your local primaries, get in touch with your local, get in touch with your local Republican Party, get in touch with your local third party if you can. But get on the ballot, because it really comes down to us to make the change that we want to see in America today.
Well, I want to thank you for coming on the King's Report, Mr. Sultan. And if people want to contact you, is there a way to contact you?
Yeah, I'm Oz for NY on Twitter, so it's OZFORNY. I'm Oz Sultan on Truth, on most of the other socials. I'm Oz Sultan X on Instagram, and my email is Oz at sultaninteractivegroup.com. So, if it can be helpful with anything, if, you're thinking policy, that kind of stuff. I mean, listen, I don't have the most time in the world. I'm still finishing up cancer therapy. But, we really need to be the change that we want to see. And it really should be listen, I have no problem with people having a gender diversity than mine, but I should have an equal right to exist as well. Right. And I think that's where most Christians and Muslims and Jews are these days in America. And I'd like to think that we could kind of continue that, because what makes us great is what Superman said. It's the diversity of this country. Right. That's what makes us better than, pretty much anywhere else. Because honestly, where else are you going to get Indian Mexican fusion cuisine right next door to a place, that has a Shoney's, and then down the corner there's sushi. I mean, it's such a great country. And if you go anywhere else, you see the economic disparity, but I just don't think enough people have traveled to really understand that and the scourge of communism. They just think it's trendy while they're drinking an $8 latte. Right.
Okay. Well, we've run out of time, but we'll have to have you come back on again on the King's Report. Thanks for sharing your time. And we're praying for your quick healing and recovery.
Thank you, Richard. It really means a lot.